October 28th, I think, Saturday, 2006. We're sitting here at the School of Mines. I'm Rob Campbell, and I have Wayne Sand here, and we're going to talk about his involvement with the T28. So,
okay.
Wayne, you want to just introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your background, when and how you came to be involved in the T28 program?
Sure. Well, I'm Wayne Sand, and actually, to start the story, I probably need to start even before the T28 days, because it was kind of an interesting evolution how I got involved in this whole thing. And it's all started with spending a summer working at Colorado State University for Dick Schleusner and a weather research program down there. And I was going to go into the military after that, since it was Vietnam era days. And I ended up staying there for 2 years and starting a master's degree program under Dick Schleusner at Colorado State University, and ended up going into the military after that. And when I left, Dick said, if you ever need a job, call. And so that's kind of what happened. I did my 5 years in the Navy, and I was in Spain, and I called Dick from Spain and said, hey, I'm trying to decide whether to stay in the Navy and fly or get out and do something else and go back and finish my master's degree. And his response was, boy, did you call it exactly the right time. And he said, I've just got the ideal job for you. And he explained a little bit about what it was about, and I took the job over the telephone from Spain, and got out of the military shortly thereafter.
When did you get out?
In 1971. And I'd been flying jets in the military and been in Vietnam, and so had had some of those kind of experiences. And had learned to fly as a teenager, so I'd been flying most of my life up to that point, or all of my life up to that point. And reported to Rapid City at any rate, and had been flying brand new jets in the Navy, and it was kind of nice. And came here, and here sat the T28 in a big puddle of oil, saying, what have I gotten myself into? Does this thing look like a thing from the wrecking yard? And so at any rate, I'd gotten checked out in T-28s in the Navy, so I knew how to fly the airplane, so that wasn't a problem. And so I started flying this thing, and in the first month of flying it, things didn't go very well. The previous pilot had had some engine problems on the airplane. He'd flown it for one season and made 5 cloud penetrations total during 1 year with the airplane, and had just a whole host of mechanical problems.
Who was that pilot, excuse me?
A man by the name of Bud Yongren,
Okay.
who's now deceased. But at any rate, Bud had some problems, and I don't know exactly what the relationship was there to be able to offer me the job, but at any rate I took it, and I showed up on the scene. And South Dakota School of Mines, being a state institution, was buying aircraft engines from the lowest bidder, which wasn't a real good deal in my mind. And the airplane had been converted from an old A model to something kind of in between. It basically had a B-17 engine on it, and most of the structure of the airplane was T-28A. And so in the first month that I flew the airplane, I had 2 engine failures. The first one, we went back and got another warranty engine from the lowest bidder, failed again, and the second time I stood out in the middle of the highway just south of Rapid City, where I landed the airplane, and told Dick Schleusner in no uncertain terms that the next step was going to be we were going to buy the best engine that money could buy, and I didn't care what it cost, or I was going to go do something else. And that's what we ended up doing. The airplane had a bunch of other problems because of the modifications they'd done on it. The fuel system was in bad shape. It had multiple fuel tanks, which were all individually selectable. And it had been armor plated just fine. All of that work was fine, but it had a bunch of other mechanical things that were bad. The firewall was too weak for the engine that was on there, and a bunch of those things. So with my connections in the Navy, what we did is disassembled the airplane at Rapid City here, put it on a truck and hauled it to Pensacola, and ran it through the Navy overhaul and rework facility, and basically put all new landing gear on it, modified the firewall and the structure in the airplane to handle a big engine. We went and got an even bigger engine than what was on there at that time, and modified the fuel system to handle that. Just basically upgraded the airplane to what would be the equivalent of a T28B. And
Yeah. Now, can you explain to us who don't know anything about airplanes, what's the difference between an A and a B? What does that signify?
yeah, it's a huge difference actually. A T28A was an Air Force airplane basically, and it was designed to fly with 800 horsepower. And the Navy T28Bs were much stronger airplanes, and they were designed to fly with 1,425 horsepower, which is what we put on there, is a 1,425 horsepower engine. The first upgrade had gone to 1,300 horsepower, and it would just, the quality of those engines just was not suitable. So we got a good engine built up and put it on there, and flew the airplane back to Rapid City and started working with it basically, and it worked fine from then.
So an A and a B are on the same, what would you call it, airframe, on the same wings?
The wings are fundamentally the same. The fuselage is fundamentally the same. The nose section of the airplane is quite a bit different. The landing gear is different. The fuel system is different. And I don't remember what else we changed on the airplane, but basically it was run through Navy rework and overhaul, which made it basically a new zero-time airframe. Fresh overhaul, everything was fixed on it, everything was upgraded, the wiring that needed to be replaced was replaced, and engine and propeller were all fresh on the thing when we got it back from the Navy. So that's what made it a B. And so the landing gear was quite a bit different on the airplane between an A and a B, because the Navy does carrier landings with these things. So they're a lot stronger landing gear. Was one of the most obvious visual changes to the airplane was the landing gear.
Now, you just sort of said briefly and calmly in passing that you had engine failures.
Right.
Can you again tell us, for those of us who have never piloted an airplane, what does that practically mean when you experience engine failure, or what happened?
Well, in these two engine failures I vividly remember because they were an interesting experience, both of them. The first one was, can't remember the name of the town about 20 or 30 miles south of here, down along the front of the Black Hills. I can't remember the name of it, but at any rate, flying over that particular little town down there. And
Hermosa, maybe?
What is it?
Something down by Hermosa?
No, it's more south.
Hot Springs, or?
Hot Springs, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, Hot Springs. And I noticed just a slight vibration in the airplane, and I said, this is not right, it's time to go back. And I thought for a moment about landing at the airport down there, which in hindsight would have been the right choice. And everything was still running, but it just didn't feel right. So I started back for Rapid City, and the further I went, the more I realized that may not have been the best decision in the world, because it started running rougher and rougher. And in this particular case, on short final at Rapid City, the tower called and informed me that my landing gear wasn't down. And I said, I know that. And if I put the gear down, I probably won't make the airport. The engine was running that badly. And I ended up blowing the landing gear down on short final landing, and the engine quit just as I landed, actually.
At Rapid City?
At Rapid City, with the cowling completely full of extraneous engine parts, some of which were necessary to make it run. And oil was flying all over the place, and we had to be towed off the runway. But it got it on the runway. And that was the first engine failure.
The engine needs to power the landing gear to go down? You thought that was more?
No, it just the extra drag for putting the gear
see.
down. I didn't need any more drag. So I figured if I put the gear down, it would increase the drag enough, I wouldn't be able to make the airport. And the blowdown system is very fast. And even if the engine's not running, that system will work. And so it's a compressed charge in there, and it blows the gear down really fast. And that's the option I chose on this particular engine failure. But it got it onto the airport at any rate, so that was good. So we put another engine on and flew it for not very long. And I was right over downtown Rapid City at 12,000 feet. And this time it was bang. I mean, everything went to pot, and the master rod, in fact, broke in this case. And the way the engine works, it throws everything out of balance, and parts started coming out of the engine in all directions. And it was a total and immediate engine failure. And I pointed right towards the airport from 12,000 feet, and it became pretty obvious that even from there I wasn't going to make the airport. So it was one of the few times in my life I actually considered getting out of the airplane, because the airframe was shaking so bad because of this master rod failure that I couldn't read the instruments. Just severe vibration. I was actually worried about the engine coming off the airplane because it was shaking so bad. So again, said, got a parachute. This may be a good choice and time to use this thing, because I thought the airplane might come apart. So at that point I said, hey, this doesn't look too cool, and I opened the canopy thinking that if things started to come apart, or appeared to, that I was going to get out of the airplane. And thought about that seriously for a little while, and then said, I think I can put it on the highway just south of Rapid City, which it turns out I did, and successfully. And there's some interesting stories go with that, because I landed it out there in the highway, came up over a hill, and there was a car coming. It's a 2-lane highway, and I coasted over the hill and turned off onto an approach to a field and stopped. And this car come up, and he looks up at this big airplane, and he just looked and kind of shook his head and drove on. And I said, okay, we'll wait from there. And finally somebody came and notified people that I was sitting beside the road with this airplane. And when we were towing the airplane back to the airport from there, which is what we did, we took the tractor on it and towed it back. The tow driver stopped and said, we're going to have to take down some road signs because it won't fit. And I said, yeah, it will. It'll fit between there. And it turns out I touched down about, I don't know, 100 feet short of these road signs. And I had less than a foot on each wingtip going through between the road signs, because I landed right smack on the center line of the highway.
You'd already gone through those signs.
I'd already gone
That's
through
how
one
you knew
way,
that it
so
would
I
go
knew
through.
it'd go back the other way. If you put it in the middle of the road, it'll fit the other way. So that's the point we tore the airplane down and took it to Pensacola and had it remanufactured. But that's what engine failures are about, in the particular ones in this case.
Yeah, and I apologize for laughing about stories about things that threatened your
That's
life.
funny.
But
It is funny.
He has a nice little piece on our workbench in the basement from that first engine failure.
Oh, yeah?
Just a
Pounded up piece of internal engine part. Yeah. It's kind of a reminder.
How many of these kind of forced landings have you experienced in other aircraft besides your T28 experiences?
Oh, early in my career, quite a few, probably half a dozen or so.
Mm-hmm.
I've had one other in a single engine airplane, and I think, no, two others in a single engine airplane, and 3 in twin engine airplanes. So maybe 7 total.
Do they make you practice these dead stick landings when you become a pilot?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Usually not at an airplane this big and heavy, though.
Yeah.
This is not something you normally, you practice it, but it's not something you really expect to do.
Can you just quickly tell us about ejection? Because I've always wondered about this. This is a plane that you can get out of.
You can get out of it. We wore a parachute in the airplane all the time. It's not an ejection. You release from the airplane and you crawl out of the airplane and free fall.
You
Just
basically
like
take
a
off your
bailout.
seatbelt.
Exactly.
And you crawl on out and jump.
Exactly. Like skydiver at that point. Yeah.
Can you just, at this point, again, for those of us who don't fly, how is flying this T28 either modified or unmodified? Because you've flown them both ways, right? How does this compare to flying other airplanes? I take it that this thing is not a glider, especially once it's armored.
No, but it flies not that much differently than a standard T28. The big difference is the mods on the airplane, and the mods make it, one, hard to see out of in some cases because the canopy was modified quite a bit, and because of what we were doing with the airplane, it made it doubly hard to see out of, because the way I routinely flew it is when the business of the airplane is flying through thunderstorms. So the way I flew it through thunderstorms is the seat had an incredible amount of adjustment to it. So I would lower the seat to where the top of the glare shield, the part that's right behind the windshield, be like the top of the dashboard, if you will, was right up here on my head. So I couldn't see anything out the front anyway, so it didn't really matter. You know, there was nothing to see. I mean, there's clouds out there, so you just lowered the seat down and got down inside this airplane and just didn't look out much. You could look up like that and I could see out, but that's really all I needed to do.
But if you did look out in the middle of a thunderstorm, what would you see? I mean, what does that look like?
Gray.
Just gray.
Well, I mean, it depends on what's out there, what stage of the storm you're in. I mean, it can be hail, it can be heavy rain, it can be lightning, it can be all kinds of things. But if you're in the cloud, it's gray, you can't see anything. I mean, you're in cloud droplets and there's nothing out there to see.
So you lowered yourself down at that point for safety, or so
Yeah,
that you
for
could...
safety, because the windshield was designed on that airplane to be able to take up to a 3-inch hailstone and not break. And while I believe the engineers, you know, that let's not push your luck here. So I said, hey, if a hailstone comes through that windshield, I don't want it to catch me right in the face. So we'll run the seat down in spite of the fact that the windshield was designed to do that. And I'm sure it could, but I just thought that was a much safer way to do it.
So a typical speed at this point as you're going through clouds, or just when you're flying the T28, is what? Do you recall?
Not sure I recall.
What kind of range?
140 knots, as I recall, something like that. I'm not sure I'm giving you the exact number.
Well, it's fine.
That's got to be pretty close.
So you were telling us, at this point you had the T28 rebuilt down in Florida.
Right.
And then, at this point, had you done any actual scientific projects? Or were these all just
With this
test planes?
airplane?
Yeah.
No, we had nothing but engine failures up to this point.
These are all
No.
just test runs.
These were all just test runs, yeah. So it was the next year before we actually started doing cloud penetrations. We lost a whole season as a result of engine failures and rebuilding the airplane. The next season we were, quote, ready to go and started using the airplane for what it was designed for.
So can you tell me about how was it to work one of these projects? What was your role in this project? How were you brought on, and how was this all scheduled?
And the big thing to keep in mind here is that this airplane was really, it's my understanding now, it's been a lot of years ago, but it was really designed for one specific purpose, and that is to make measurements inside thunderstorms. And there was a lot of work done before I ever came on the scene to build this airplane up to be able to do that, and they did all the mods to it. Now, the project that it was really designed for was something called the National Hail Research Experiment, and that's the only project I flew this airplane on. It was this big, very large project organized by the National Science Foundation. There were a lot of airplanes involved. The T28 was one of the key airplanes because we were very, very interested in what was going on in the inside of a thunderstorm. And prior to that, nobody had been there to look, you know, with enough instruments to be able to measure what was going on. So that's what the whole purpose of the experiment was. And so the way this was done was the project was run in northeastern Colorado. And a number of ground radar sites were down there, and we had people from the School of Mines here going down to support the T28. And the key people there were, of course, a lot of technicians and engineers and those kinds of folks, scientists. But as far as flying the airplane through the clouds, all the time I flew it, I worked with a man called Dennis Mussel. And Dennis was the guy on the radar, and we had worked out procedures for doing thunderstorm penetrations, and abort procedures and all kinds of things of how do you do this and do it safely and get the data we need. So that's what we were doing. Is Dennis would look at the radar, figure out what part of the storm we needed to go into. He was tracking the airplane on radar, and he would basically give me a vector, say, hey, take up a heading of such and such through this storm, and I would look out, take a peek up over the window, if you will, and say, yeah, this looks good to me. We'd agree. We'd start into the storm, and our procedure is that unless things really went to heck, once you committed to go, you went straight. You didn't turn. You didn't do anything. You went right straight through it
Until you were at the
until you
far
were
end
out
of
the
storm.
other side.
Hmm.
You just lowered your head and charged, if you will, and you didn't deviate for anything. And the whole object of the exercise at that point was really counterintuitive to most pilots, because the way we flew this and the design of the experiment and the way we set it up was with air traffic control, was that we had an altitude block clearance. In other words, I usually had a 6,000 foot block altitude to work in, and frequently used it all and then some, because we flew the airplane at constant airspeed and didn't worry about the altitude. So the altitude would go up and down a lot, and all I was concerned with is keeping the wings relatively level and keeping the speed under control. And that's how we flew it.
And you'd obviously just try to keep on the same heading.
Keep on the same heading, exactly.
You know, 198 or whatever the number was, stick to it.
Whatever the number was, stick to it, yeah.
Can you explain for someone like me what kind of flying instruments were on the T28?
Well, the thing of it is the T28 to start with is an aerobatic airplane, so it's stressed for a lot of G's. And the instruments on there then were designed to be flown aerobatically. I mean, you could roll the airplane, and so it had attitude. They were pretty conventional instruments, but they were designed to do rolls and loops and all that kind of stuff without dumping the gyros, if you will. So we had backup systems in there for attitude reference, but they were pretty garden variety instruments, really, that most airplanes have. The difference was they were aerobatic quality, so that you could do a lot of jostling of the airplane, and the gyros would still keep telling you which way was up.
So did you ever roll this airplane?
Many times.
Oh, all the time?
Yeah, for fun. Yeah. I mean, you could do that with the airplane, and it was a lot of fun to do. It was a nice aerobatic airplane.
So, what years about, or how many seasons did you do this work on this?
I was here at the School of Mines for 5 years. And during that time, one of the agreements when I came here is that I would have a full-time job and I would be allowed to pursue a master's degree, because I about half completed it under Dr. Schleusner down at Colorado State. And he agreed to be my advisor up here as well. So I finished my master's degree at Mines here under Dick, and flew the airplane for 5 years. And the data I gathered with the T28 was what I used for my master's degree.
So you have a master's degree in?
I guess it's called meteorology here.
Meteorology. And so what was your full-time job? You had a full-time job as well?
Yeah, doing research and flying airplanes.
Oh, here at School of Mines?
Yep.
So you were a full-time employee of
School
the
of
state of
Mines.
School of Mines,
Yes.
as well as a student?
Yep.
So did the program change over those 5 years? Or were you basically doing the same sorts of things all the time? Do you remember where you were physically doing these projects? I know you're in Colorado, right? Any other places?
Yeah, the whole time we were in Colorado.
Oh, okay.
Northeast Colorado. So they have a very high frequency of hail in that particular area, so hence it was chosen for this experiment. And that's where we spent the whole time. Every summer we'd be down there for the whole summer.
Did you have any trouble with this airplane after it was rebuilt down in Pensacola?
Relatively minor stuff, but yeah, nothing extraordinary. No, it worked very well after that. Very well behaved.
How common was it that you would get too far into the hailstorm and they would back you out of it? Was that every day, or not every day, but?
Almost never. I mean, we had an escape route. I maybe said that a little bit wrong. We got a heading to go through it, and you'd never turn around, but the agreement was if you get in trouble, turn, out to the right or out to the left or whatever, and he'd give me a heading to get out of there if we needed to. And almost never did we do that. Normally just lower your head and go.
When you were flying through the storms, you were in radio contact?
Yes.
With Dennis?
With Dennis.
And that's it? Dennis
No, with the air traffic control people as well.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
So we ran 2 radios on the airplane, and the decision was made pretty early on to fly it with just the pilot, by the way. Because one of the initial thought was that you'd have a scientist on board or a technician or somebody to run the instruments. And it ended up that we flew it with just the pilot, and I ran everything in the airplane. Basically, the data system was on and off, and I had the vent marks, and so it was very involved scientifically.
Yeah, I've heard about this decision. As you understand it, was that for reasons of space or for safety or?
It was probably a combination of things. I think it was a reason for safety. It probably was some for space. It was some for weight. It was probably a lot of reasons. But I think it was the right decision, really, because I think I would hate to be the guy in the back seat on this airplane. I really would hate to be that. I wouldn't like it.
Did you love being the guy in the front seat? Did you
I
really
enjoyed
enjoy
it, yeah.
flying this, or was this just a job, or was this?
No. I really enjoyed it. And you know, the crazy thing is that I've got to tell you this story because it exemplifies what people were thinking at that point. Because most people thought I was totally crazy for doing this to start with, because they said, why you got to be crazy to fly an airplane through thunderstorms and on purpose encounter hail? Because we went in full well knowing that we would expect and accept up front 3/4 inch hail. And we knew that before we ever started the penetration. And the airplane was designed to withstand 3-inch hail. So we had that cushion. And you know, most people say you got to be crazy to do this because the turbulence level was pretty severe. I mean, I spent the whole summer with black and blue shoulders and lap belt from getting hammered against the straps all the time. But I forgot where I was going with this story. At any rate, the turbulence and the up and down drafts were the hard part to deal with, because you're sitting here looking at 6,000 feet a minute plus up and down, and so you're getting hammered around pretty good in the storm as you're going. But the point is that my background before that had been that I had just gotten back from Vietnam, you know, where they launched me off a carrier in the middle of the night and shot at me, and I came back and landed, you know, in ugly weather on a black deck and all that kind of stuff. And my attitude was, it can't be any worse than that, you know. And it turns out it wasn't. You know, it was just, you take a bunch of precautions and just do what you can. And we did it safely for those first few years, and then after that, you know, the airplane flew safely for many more years after that, once we got it going. One of the interesting anecdotes, you asked for problems on the airplane, I just happened to think of this. One of the biggest problems we had after we got the thing back together and going again is that we'd encounter hail and it would bend the cooling fins on the cylinders on the engine. And that's some of the damage it would do, and the mechanics would straighten the cooling fins out with pliers. And it ended up after that was the biggest problem we had for a while, was that we were changing cylinders because they could only straighten those cooling fins so many times and they were tending to break. And so we changed a few cylinders on the airplane as a result of the fins just being worn out from being bent so many times. The engine ran fine.
While you were flying through a storm, were there all kinds of scientific instruments that you had to be controlling or monitoring, or flip them on or flip them off? Was that a different element of this kind of flying?
Yep. Yeah, it was like you just talked to Ted Cannon. You know, his camera was a manual thing. You know, you turned it on, you turned it off, because it produced so much data that you couldn't leave it on all the time. There was a foil impactor that you started and stopped, and trying to think of what else we had on there that you had to fiddle with all the time. But there was a lot of stuff that, you know, a lot of these instruments were developmental. They were one of a kind. And so there was generally a lot of fooling with the instruments and, you know, turning the data system on. And then I had a voice recorder in there as well, that I ran a continuous voice commentary as we were flying as well, describing what I was seeing and you know, what was going on in the storm. So it was busy.
Yeah. I imagine that's an understatement. Do we still have these voice recordings?
Somebody probably does.
You don't, though.
I don't. No, I'm sure they're at School of Mine someplace.
That would be interesting to hear. Although maybe it's just maybe it just sounds like a rock concert with some guy trying to talk over the noise. I don't know.
Well, there's some of it, but the other thing is that it was kind of fun because it was a dual channel recorder. Now that I'm thinking about that, and the other microphone was mounted on the backside of the windshield, so you could actually hear hail impacting. And that was one of the sensors on the airplane, was actually this acoustic sensor of hail on the windshield.
Have you ever flown through a storm like this in any other kind of aircraft? How unusual is this for a pilot? I understand that you know, when I get on the 737, they don't fly me through a thunderstorm. But
Well, pilots try to avoid this like the plague. I mean, you don't ever intentionally do this, ever. And pilots are trained from day one not to do this kind of thing because of the turbulence, the lightning, the hail, and all of these hazards that exist in there. The wind shear. There's just all kinds of things, reasons that you should not fly in this kind of storm. And so, have I flown in this kind of stuff with other airplanes? Yeah, but not in the part where I would expect to get hail, because that damages other airplanes, and this airplane was designed to deal with the hail. That was the nice part, and it did a good job of that.
the hail is the real whammy.
The hail is the real whammy, because you can do, I flew a King Air for years after this, another research airplane, and one of our pilots did, I've forgotten the number now, but of order $100,000 worth of damage to the airplane in a matter of seconds by accidentally flying into some hail.
The first time you were ever flying through one of these storms was in the T28?
Yeah.
Do you remember your first, remember that first flight, or was it pretty routine?
No, nothing was routine in this thing. No, it wasn't. There was nothing routine about this flying, really. It was very specialized, and it turned out that I felt I was nicely trained for it because of the military training I had. I'd flown weather research before I went in the military, so I was familiar with that. I worked around weather mod programs, so I was familiar with a lot of that kind of stuff. And then in the military, we did, IFR aerobatics and all kinds of crazy stuff that made me comfortable flying the airplane. That wasn't the issue at all. But flying it in hail, then that became the domain of the engineers who designed the airplane. Say, hey, it's really suitable to do that, and we've adequately protected it so you can fly this thing without tearing the airplane up and killing yourself, and that's what we did.
Is this up among the most interesting experiences you've had in a plane?
Yeah, it's right up there.
It
Yeah.
is.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because there's just a handful of people who've had an opportunity to fly this thing, which you're probably aware. And it's a one-of-a-kind airplane. It's one of a kind, designed for a special job that nothing else is going to do. And so there's just a handful of us out there in the world who've had an opportunity to fly this thing, and I think that's great. And I enjoyed it a lot when I was doing it, and I look back on it with a lot of good memories. Had a lot of fun. Well, the other thing is it provided the data. I mean, this is an important aspect. It provided all the data that I needed to do my master's thesis, and it provided all of the data I needed to do my PhD. Because I took the data from here and a grant from the National Science Foundation to the University of Wyoming and finished my PhD down there, because they didn't have a program here then. And so they recruited me to go down there and fly their airplanes. But I brought the data and the funding with me to finish my PhD while I was there.
This is the interesting thing that I had not known about you, is that, you and Dennis Mussel can really talk about the weather, and you can really understand
yeah.
each other.
Yeah.
Which is, I'm guessing, not a common thing for most pilots' background.
Well, it makes pilots unique in this field. If you can find somebody who has a meteorology background and an aviation background that's willing to do this kind of stuff, that's pretty rare. Because at Wyoming even, I tried to find pilots that could do that and that had that kind of background, and it's just about impossible to do.
Can you explain briefly for me what particular questions you were looking at in your master's thesis and PhD dissertation?
Well,
what part of this problem?
The PhD really was to try and understand how the storm worked, and so my PhD dissertation was developing a conceptual model of a multi-cell thunderstorm, and I use that to this day when I teach this kind of material, as I teach some courses still to engineers and so on who design airplanes and stuff, and I use the data that I gathered and the results of my PhD dissertation in teaching them how to understand, how to think about the storm, how does this thing work, and how can you, I teach test pilots, okay, so they need to know how they can go gather data for icing, for instance, for aircraft icing. they need to understand these multi-cell thunderstorms to be able to do that safely with an airplane that's not armored. Because they have to fly in some of this kind of stuff, but not too far into it. And there's a very definite limit there that they can go and can't go. So those are the kind of questions I was looking at for that. The Masters was more looking at how much liquid water content was there. That was a huge question that we went into this program with, is what was the liquid water content in the core of a thunderstorm? Because at that point, the Soviets had hypothesized that you had this thing called super adiabatic liquid water. Well, that was a question we were trying to answer. Was there an area in the thunderstorm that had super adiabatic liquid water, or was there not? So a lot of instrumentation that was built was designed to try to answer that question. So some of the first penetrations were really, can we build an instrument that can measure it if we've got it? And how much faith do we have in it even if we can measure it? So we carried a lot of stuff on the airplane to look at that. The other thing was the growth mechanism for hail. So we were doing a lot of work looking at what hail is there, what's the size distribution, what's the structure of the hail, what's the number concentrations, those kinds of questions. So that was really a lot of what the T28 was designed for. The other thing was to look at the dynamics of what was going on in the storm. In other words, how strong are the updrafts, how strong are the downdrafts, what's the turbulence like? Can you get recirculation of hailstones? Is the structure of the storm suitable for that kind of thing? So those were some of the initial questions that were going on. And then the other thing was they were doing some random experimental cloud seeding of these things as well. So we were looking for differences in the inside of the storm, whether it had been seeded or not. And so those were some of the key questions, as I recall, there were lots more I know, but those are some of the keys that we were looking at with the T28.
So you were flying through seeded and unseeded clouds.
Yes.
Did you know if it was a seeded cloud or an unseeded cloud?
No.
It was supposed to be blind in that regard.
Yes.
And I take it that all of these questions about how the storms form and hail development and all of that are much better understood today than they were, say, in 1971.
I would like to think so. Yeah, I would like to think so. I think there's a lot of things about these storms that are better understood today as a result of the work that's been done with the T28 over the years. I mean, the National Hail Research Experiment was a big event. It cost a lot of money. And I think it answered a lot of questions. The one question that one key question they were really looking at is, can you effectively see thunderstorms and suppress hail? And that question came out, I think, kind of unanswered.
Can you give me an idea of the relative importance of the T28 among this whole array of instruments? You know, we have radar and various airplanes. How does the T28 fit in there, and how significant was that?
Well, I'm biased, of course, but I think the T28 was key to this whole thing, because you needed to make the measurements inside the storm. I mean, we'd been making measurements outside the storm and through bits and pieces of it for years. But the thing that had never been done is to make the measurements inside the storm, and this airplane enabled you to do that. It did it for, whatever it was, 35 years or something, 30-some years. And, you know, that was key. And I think it was a key instrument in the whole experiment, a very key and important tool, if not maybe the most important tool.
I'm just going to ask you a question I wonder about, because
Sure.
I sit here and I imagine you up in this cloud. And that's the hardest thing for people, I think, to imagine.
Sure.
Did you ever wonder about the very heart of the storm? You know, that red zone at 80 dBz or whatever. Were you ever curious about that? Did you ever have an itch to go in there? Or I know you would go in there.
Well, we set our limit at 55 dBz. Okay, 55 dBz is allegedly kind of the borderline at 3/4 inch hail. That's what you can expect. If it was more than that, we said, now you start to crowd the limit, and you could start getting some of those 3-inch hailstones. My feeling was that at 55 dBz, you were probably as strong as the storm was going to get anyway. If you were going to go into something with 80 dBz, all that says is the hail's bigger. I mean, because of the radar equations, the way they work, It's a huge function of the size of the particle. I don't know whether you understand the math there, but it's to the 6th power
Yeah, it's a
of
power
the diameter.
function, and so
Yeah.
so an addition in dBz means a much larger hail, or do I have that backwards?
No, if you increase the size of the particle a little bit, because you take it to the 6th power, the reflectivity goes out of sight very quickly. So all 80 dBz means, in my view, is you have big stuff in there, and maybe lots of it. But the radar equation starts to limit you in where you can go in this whole combination of drop size and droplet concentration and so on to still fit within the radar equation. So 80 dBz, while it sounds good, all it really means is that it's had a chance to grow bigger hail. I don't think it means that the storm is much stronger in terms of updrafts and turbulence. I really don't think there's much difference. So I think with the 55 dBz limit, my personal opinion is we were flying into about as strong as you're going to get anyway.
So there would not have been that much better scientific data had you been able to go anywhere in the storm?
No, I don't think so.
Or was that a big temptation to say, boy, we'd really like to see this zone, or we'd really like to see that zone?
Didn't seem to be a driver then, because the interest was more in the development of the hail. In other words, from the time it first formed until it got big enough to be damaging hail on the ground. And that was the time that the interest level was really high. So once you get to 3/4 inch hail, you're going to do a ton of damage on the ground. And pea-size hail will do a lot of damage. And 3-inch hail, as it turns out, when you start to get stones that big, there are not very many of them. And so you just don't get many. But you have this huge reflectivity, and they're the kind of things that. And a good example of a friend of mine was flying a cloud seeding airplane, actually, and cut across between 2 thunderstorms, clear sky, getting back to the airport, and he said he saw them coming. And they were these kind of things. And he laid down in the seat and turned, and he was only hit with 2 stones. One came through the windshield and ended up in the baggage compartment of the airplane, and the other one came through the radome on the airplane. Came right through it. But he only got hit with 2 stones. But did a lot of damage to the airplane.
Any other T28 stories you want to tell?
Well, there's probably lots, but no, it was a fun airplane to fly. As far as flying the airplane goes, it was a challenge because there's a lot of things to do in that kind of airplane. I mean, the motor takes a lot of attention. The data system took a lot of attention on this airplane, so it was a lot to do. I guess we grew very cautious with engines, and so when anything didn't even look close to right, we took that very seriously and did something about it real quick. I had an oil light come on one time, a sump light it's called. It means you've got metal in the oil in the bottom of the engine. So this light comes on, and I did an emergency landing down in Greeley, Colorado. We pulled the plug out, and here's a little piece of metal about this big in the sump. Nobody could tell me what it was. And I said, I don't like the sound of this. I need to know what that piece is. Where did it come from? And I personally put this piece of metal in my pocket, started going to engine shops. Finally found an engine, and everybody looked at it and said, I don't know what it is. Finally found a guy who looked at it and said, oh yeah, I know what that is. And he told me what it was. And I said, okay, it's fine, let's go back to work. But I wasn't about to launch with that engine again until I knew exactly where that piece of metal came from. But so those are, we had those kind of things go on, and it's just, you're taking enough risk to begin with. You don't need to take off with an engine you don't know where a piece of metal came from.
Did you ever cause a project to lose data acquisition days because you were not comfortable with the aircraft or anything like that?
Oh yeah, we lost a number of days when that piece of metal ended up in the oil, because it took me about few days. I don't remember the number, but I know I was coming back just bushed because I'd been all around the country. I'd got on the airlines and just went until I found somebody who could tell me what that piece was without tearing the engine down. And so I found somebody in an engine shop in Florida who knew what it was.
It turns out he was right.
He was right. And as I'm coming back to Cheyenne, Wyoming, where the airplane was based, flying from Denver up to Cheyenne, and I called some of my colleagues on the phone and said, radio or something, I can't remember, I was talking to somebody at any rate and said, I'm coming back, I know what's wrong, we're ready, good to go. And basically they said, get out here as soon as you can, get in the airplane, we got a storm going right now, let's go.
But they didn't give you any pressure before then, say, well...
No. You know, as a pilot, you can't do that.
Right.
You can't accept that kind of pressure. No, something was wrong, and our experience with the airplane had been in my experience, had been 2 engine failures, and I think Bud had at least one before me. So it's, we'd had enough issues with engines that nobody was willing to take any chances with engines.
Were there ever tensions, competitive or other kinds of tensions between the different teams who were working on these big projects? Or between individuals on the teams?
I mean, nothing other than personal stuff. I didn't consider it significant.
Yeah.
No.
I have one more question I want to ask.
My wife will tell you I don't consider things like that significant at all most of the time, so I ignore them. I'm not bothered with that.
You didn't care if they were fighting with each other.
They can fight all they want, as long as I can keep my path going and I can stay pretty focused most of the time. So those things don't bother me even if they are going on.
He has an innate ability to stay extremely focused. I mean, this building could be caving down and he'd say, oh, well, I didn't hear anything, I didn't see anything.
Hey, Maggie, you're the one I should be asking about this guy. What am I not picking up from these stories? For example, when my wife delivered a child, going into the early stages, I said, now you're not going to recognize when she's feeling uncomfortable. She'll look just fine to you, not because she's stoic, just because she gets a blank look.
Yeah.
I said, I'm telling you now, doctor. And it happened exactly that way. I said, you better check her temperature. She was like 104. So.
Yeah.
Anything you want to say about this before I ask my last question?
Just that Wayne he's extremely focused and a perfectionist with his career. And his example of the metal in the engine, it's funny because Wayne was my professor and advisor when I was at Wyoming, now husband, but one of my classmates used to fly with Wayne at Wyoming, and Ken dropped a paperweight on the floor of the King Air. Wayne wouldn't take off until they found that paper clip for fear that it could jam itself in some instrument or anything. So that's just one example of how Wayne puts safety above a lot of things. And then another person I know who actually used the data that Wayne collected for research said that the data that Wayne did collect in all of his flying is some of the most perfect data sets because he had such a great ability to keep the aircraft perfectly level or at true airspeed. So it was always a constant and very clean data without a lot of interference. And they were very grateful for his data sets. And as far as I know to this day, and I'm still in touch with some of these people, there's no data like what he had collected with the T28.
So there.
Nice words. I sympathize because I once witnessed a coffee mug get lodged under the brake pedal of a car. That's not,
Oh, wow.
That's not pretty.
No, it's not pretty.
My last thing I was just curious about, I'm interested in this particular T28. You told me some about how it was reworked. Before it was reworked in Pensacola, it had been worked on by various people.
Yeah.
And I don't know how much of that you know from before your time.
Yeah, I know probably most of it. I'm trying to remember where this airplane came from, but first of all, it came from the Air Force, okay, because it started out its life as an A. And it flew as a photo reconnaissance airplane, I think in South America for a while. And it became available and it was purchased, and this is kind of an interesting story, it was purchased by Paul McCready, Atmospherics, I think is the name of the company. That doesn't sound, that's not right. Paul McCrady's the guy's name at any rate, who got the contract to build this airplane up. And Paul is a huge name in this business. I mean, I could tell you stories all day about this guy. But he and his engineers really are the ones who designed and did the engineering on the airplane. They bought it and did all that work, and that's all the money they had, was to do the mods to make it withstand 3-inch hail. That was the requirement. Then the airplane was sold to the School of Mines for $1, which is kind of an interesting number. And the airplane came up here then with basically it was a T28A airframe that it had they call them STCs, supplemental type certificates, on the airplane to put this B-17 engine on it. And so that was, at that time, a relatively standard mod for some of these. I shouldn't say standard because there were never that many of them built. But it had been put on a number of airplanes at that time. It was an okay engine. You know, B-17s flew for a long time, but they weren't terribly reliable, that particular dash number engine. And so when this airplane was modified to the equivalent of a T-28B, it became a one-of-a-kind, very unique airplane at that point, because very few A's went to B's. Most of them went to D's, which is they left the same landing gear on, they put the same big engine on, but they left the landing gear. And they sold a whole bunch of these things to small undeveloped countries, I guess, and they became bombers and fighters and all kinds of stuff. But those were the standard mods, and even today you'll see a lot of T-28Ds advertised, and maybe not a lot, but occasionally you'll see one. And that's the origin of a D, is it started out as an A and had these engine mods done on it. But this airplane was unique because it started out as an A and basically ended up as a B, which is a really unique change. There's a bunch of B's became surplus from the Navy because those were all Navy airplanes. And a T-28C is different yet. It's a shorter propeller blades and has a tail hook for carrier landings.
Is the T-20 or T-28s in general, not this particular plane, are they a well-known aircraft among pilots, or is it just an obscure military aircraft, or
No,
somewhere in the middle?
The
or?
T-28 was originally designed to train pilots in really high-performance propeller-driven airplanes. And that's what it was designed for. It was a relatively high-performance single-engine airplane that required a lot of trimming. Because every time you change something on the airplane, you have to retrim everything. And that's really what it was designed to train pilots to do. And then to train them in aerobatics and a somewhat heavier airplane, really to teach pilots how to fly things like P-51s, stuff like that. This was kind of a precursor to those kinds of airplanes. You know, big, powerful, piston-driven airplanes for the most part.
So for guys who went through the military, I don't know, 50s, 60s, a lot of them would fly a T-28 at some point in their training?
Yeah, and in fact, into the 70s, they were still training in T-28s in the Navy.
It's designed to be sort of a generic high-performance propeller aircraft.
Yeah, exactly.
So if you could fly that, you're
Yeah.
almost ready to fly this or that or whatever.
Yeah, in the Navy, even when I went through training in the Navy, it was used as if you went propellers in the Navy, you got to fly T-28s. And I'd been flying a similar big round engine airplane for Dick Schleusner, actually, before I went in the Navy. So I said, yeah, I already know how to do that. So I ended up going to the jet pipeline once you finish primary training in propellers, which was not very much, then I went straight to jets, where all of my colleagues went through T-28s.
What should I call this plane? You guys never had a name for this particular plane? It's a T-28. It's a T-28.
People always refer to it as the armored T-28. That's all.
The armored T-28.
Yeah.
People often, now my memory's failing me. The word.
There's a word for it. It's called the Trojan.
Yeah,
Is that
Trojan.
you're
What does that
looking for?
mean?
That's just a name for it. It's the military tagged it as a Trojan. You know, like the A-10 is a Warthog.
Oh, okay. But Trojan just means T-28.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So
Yeah.
Trojan is not a variety of a T-28.
No, it's just a
The
generic
T-28, the Trojan.
The Trojan,
I see. So
exactly.
that doesn't mean, this is just the armored T-28.
Yeah.
You guys never called it anything else?
No, not that I didn't.
The plane.
I sometimes called it some things I probably ought to repeat at this point, but generally no.
Well, Wayne, thank you very much. I do appreciate
Certainly.
your time today.
You bet.
Thanks
Thank
very
you,
much.
Rob.
Now we're embarrassing Wayne a little bit.
We're embarrassing
That's okay.
Wayne a little bit.
It's all for history, Wayne.
It's all for history. When I went through Navy training, they have, everything is graded. Everything you do is graded. And it turns out that it's about a 1.5-year program to go through the Navy pilot training program. And at the end of that period, for that year, for the year that they counted score, it turned out that I came out #1 in the Navy training program. So it was Outstanding Student Naval Aviator of the Year was the official title of this thing. And it was basically, I scored #1 out of about 2,000 pilots that went through the program that year. So that's it,
Congratulations.
embarrassing. But that's fact.
Well, just
Anything
that-
else?
It's kind of like
Bring
the
up?
valedictorian of your class, you know, so that's what it was.
Well, I think just the fact that his data was so clean. And I mean, when I was in school, everybody raved about, Dr. Sand's data. So
Good data set.
everybody wanted his
Well,
data.
it's-
Yeah.
Yeah, but and I did this kind of flying for 12 years at the University of Wyoming after I left here, flying twin engine airplanes, doing weather research too. So, I've gathered a lot of data in weather, various kinds.
What was the first plane you ever flew?
Piper Cub,
How old were you?
probably about 17.
How'd you get into flying?
I just liked it. The
Just-
idea and hung around the airport until the guy gave me a job. Taught me how to fly as a fringe benefit of the job. Yeah. Worked for a crop sprayer when I was in high school and college.
Where was that? Where were you growing up?
Montana. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Wayne.
You bet.